recently published our ACCC year in review. Covers a lot of different sectors, but I guess one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, Chris, were what did you think the major theme was for 2019?
It really was a year for penalties. I mean, we commented at the start of last year that 2018 was a record year for penalties, and that was backed by the ACCC making use of some legislative reform and really starting to deliver on its goals of pushing the upper limits of penalties. And 2019 was just a continuation of that. We had record penalties for both the ACL and under the CCA. So firstly, Volkswagen was fined $125 million.
Interestingly, they've just appealed that, but that's the largest ever penalty of its kind in this space in Australia.
Under the ACL, and that was for false and misleading representations in relation to its compliance with diesel standards. The most interesting thing about that case was that the court rejected the parties' initial agreed penalty of $75 million and upped the ante an additional $50 million. And I think the court commented at the time that the agreed penalty was outrageous and that it was completely insufficient given the scale and deliberateness of Volkswagen's conduct.
Yeah, I think people would agree with that when you look at this was a worldwide scandal that VW was deliberately a part of. So I can understand why the judge took the view that they did. It'll be interesting to see what happens on appeal.
On the CCA side, we also had the largest criminal fine under the CCA in Australian history, and that was $34.5 million that K-Line was fined for its involvement in a cartel related to the transportation of vehicles to Australia.
Still not as big as the types of fines and the size of fines that we see in Europe and in the US. Certainly getting higher and closer to the ACCC's goal of matching European fines, but a big fine nonetheless.
Exactly. If this trend of increasing penalties continues, then who knows what's in store for 2020.
Yeah, and I can imagine Rod Sims, the chairman of the ACCC, he'd be rubbing his hands together because his view is that fines in Australia shouldn't simply be the cost of doing business. They've got to be significant and they've got to impact the share price of businesses. So very interesting to see what happens this year.
Yep.
So apart from penalties, any other significant developments that you think are worthy of comment?
Yeah, so we saw towards the end of the year the ACCC's first proceedings under the new bulked up misuse of market power provisions. We'd been hearing reports from the ACCC that it had a number of investigations ongoing in this area, and we'd been hearing those reports for some time. So it was a case of waiting with bated breath as to see when and who they pulled the trigger against. And we saw towards the end of the year they pulled the trigger against Tasports. So that's definitely one to watch for the year ahead.
And so those proceedings are currently before the courts and are being defended. Yeah. So we may not get a trial on that this year, actually. It may not be a result until next year. So definitely watch this space. I think everyone would be keen to see how these new provisions actually work and how the court's going to approach them.
Absolutely.
So other misuse of market power, any other significant developments?
Yeah, the ACCC had its first enforcement win in the new under the new concerted practices provisions as well.
Wow, a win. Generous.
That's probably being generous. They got undertakings against two roofing companies in Sydney who had some discussions on Facebook in relation to potentially setting some minimum prices for the repair of hail-damaged houses following a storm in Sydney.
Well, you think about where this legislation originated with price fixing in petrol stations and also in relation to banks, to the fact that a couple of small roofing contractors, chatting to each other on Facebook caught the attention of the ACCC. I think that was a little bit of a surprise to most people.
Maybe it's just dipping its toes in the water and we'll see bigger and better things in 2020.
Yeah. All right, so other than those significant developments, anything else?
Yeah, we had the ACCC was successful in its prosecution of cryosite in relation to gun jumping. So that's something that had never previously been tested under Australian law. We've seen it overseas. And I guess it's a timely reminder that for parties to a transaction that you can't stop competing until the transaction actually completes.
Yeah. So those are your significant wins. I was interested in some areas where, I think the ACCC was surprised they didn't win. The cases that I'm particularly interested in, there's the ACCC action against TPG for its prepayments in mobile phone contracts. very interesting to see that the judge found that the clause was transparent and readily understood by consumers and therefore wasn't unfair. The big surprise there is that a judge actually thinks that people read their mobile phone contracts.
That judge is probably the only person who's ever done it.
I bet you that judge hasn't, but anyway. I guess the other thing worth commenting on is the ACCC lost 2 proceedings against, one against Woolworths and one against Kimberly-Clark in relation to some claims they were making about products that they manufacture and sell. One of the ACCC's key strategies in those sorts of product claim cases is to shift responsibility to the person making the product claim to prove that they had reasonable grounds for doing so. And the courts, in 2 separate decisions, has really poured cold water on that strategy. I think that's surprising. I don't think it actually represents the law. So it's on appeal. It'd be interesting to see how the appeal court deals with it, the full court.